Since it launched its deadly bombardment of Gaza, the US has pledged $14 billion in extra aid to Israel, and it doesn't seem to come with any strings attached. 2 weeks ago, the White House said they are not drawing any red lines for Israel. That statement was made by National Security spokesperson John Kirby, and yesterday he repeated the line again.
In late October, you had referred to the fact that the administration is not drawing any red lines for Israel. As the death toll for civilians in the Gaza Strip has gone up, I wanted to ensure, is that still the case, that the administration has no red lines?
That is still the case.
So after white phosphorus has been dropped in heavily populated areas, after ambulances, hospitals and refugee camps have been bombed, and with 10,000 people already killed, 4,000 of them children, the US still has no red lines. No red lines. There's nothing that Israel could do that would make them stop giving them unconditional support. And that's despite the US admitting Israel is doing little to avoid civilian casualties. This tweet is from a CNN journalist. On Israeli efforts to minimize civilian casualties, John Kirby says, "We have seen some indications that there are efforts being applied in certain scenarios to try to minimize civilian casualties, but I don't want to overstate that." So essentially, sometimes they do seem to be trying to minimize civilian casualties, but I don't really want to overstate that because a lot of the time they aren't. I mean, you don't have to try too hard to read between the lines to see that that's what's being said there, right? And fine, they'll say, we've said that publicly. That means we're putting pressure on Israel. No, unless you stop sending them $14 billion of aid and shed loads of military equipment, saying something to some journalists is meaningless, right? The US has leverage. It likes to pretend it doesn't, but it has a lot of leverage here. So when might the US stop backing its closest ally as it pulverizes Gaza? The Economist has a new article out which isn't reassuring. So they write, although he now supports humanitarian pauses to allow more aid to enter Gaza, Mr. Biden has rejected calls for an outright ceasefire. But administration officials have made clear in a series of leaks that they doubt Israel has a coherent exit strategy in Gaza. They complain that Mr. Netanyahu is barely willing to discuss the topic and say they want to put their concerns on the record now, lest the war end badly. So we just want to put it on record. We're going to put it on record. We're going to fund you and arm you to the teeth, even though we think this is a terrible idea, but we're just going to have it written down just in case anyone wants accountability afterwards, after you've killed 50,000 Gazans and achieved nothing from it. Ask the Americans why they supported that. Oh no, we have this little note. We sent it to Netanyahu. Can you try and kill a few less people and have some war aims? That is not going to excuse what you have done, right? The Economist goes on to write this. Sources in Washington think it will still be several more weeks before Mr. Biden pivots to talk of a truce. But do not doubt that he will make such a shift. So he will make the shift eventually. This is a pointless war with no exit strategy, but will still give them a few weeks to keep killing innocent kids. Morally abject. That seems to be the message from President Biden right now. Meanwhile, in the United States, one of the only voices in Washington to have spoken any sense in recent weeks has been punished. Rashida Tlaib is the only Palestinian-American representative in Congress, and after defending the phrase "from the river to the sea," she has become only the third person this century to be censured by her peers. Being censured is one step down from being expelled from the House, and it has to be passed by a majority in the House of Representatives. Here's how Tlaib responded.
I'm the only Palestinian American serving in Congress, Mr. Chair, and my perspective is needed here now more than ever. I will not be silenced, and I will not let you distort my words. Folks forget I'm from the city of Detroit, the most beautiful, blackest city in the country, where I learned to speak truth to power even if my voice shakes. Trying to bully or censor me won't work, because this movement for a ceasefire is much bigger than one person. It's growing every single day. There are millions of people across our country who oppose Netanyahu's extremism and are done watching our government support collective punishment and the use of white phosphorus bombs that melt flesh to the bone. They are done watching our government, Mr. Chair, supporting cutting off food, water, electricity, and medical care to millions of people with nowhere to go. Like me, Mr. Chair, they don't believe the answer to war crimes is more war crimes. The refusal of Congress and the administration to acknowledge Palestinian lives is chipping away at my soul. Over 10,000 Palestinians have been killed. Majority were children. But let me be clear. My criticism has always been of the Israeli government and Netanyahu's actions. It is important to separate people and governments, Mr. Chair. No government is beyond criticism. The idea that criticizing the government of Israel is anti-Semitic sets a very dangerous precedent, and it's being used to silence diverse voices speaking up for human rights across our nation.
Now, how is that moment going to go down in the history books? We are facing the mass murder of Palestinian people, a potential genocide, and the only Palestinian American in Congress wasn't just not listened to, she was silenced. Now, as I said before on the show, I have no problem with the phrase, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." That's the phrase that Tlaib defended. It's associated with a one-state solution in Israel-Palestine, which is a completely legitimate position. But even if you happen to not like the phrase, if you're very committed to a two-state solution and think "from the river to the sea" suggests something else, you should still know that this censure was an incredibly extreme response. And to know that, just look at what you can get away with saying in Congress. Now, Brian Mast is a Republican member of the House of Representatives.
I would encourage the other side to not so lightly throw around the idea of innocent Palestinian civilians, as is frequently said. I don't think we would so lightly throw around the term innocent Nazi civilians during World War II.
But we might have said innocent German civilians in World War II, right? Innocent German civilians. It's also the case that even people who were fighting for the Nazi army, right? You can still commit war crimes against them, you know? You're not allowed to just indiscriminately kill soldiers, for example, once they've, waved the white flag, right? There are no innocent Palestinian civilians. That's what he said. It's very clearly a call for genocide, right? From the river to the sea, whatever you think about it, that is not a call for genocide. You might prefer a two-state and say that's not my favorite chant, fine. But that guy was in Congress calling for genocide, essentially, right? There are no innocent Palestinians. There are no innocent Palestinians. What does that suggest? If Israel said, our goal is to destroy Hamas, and he's now speaking in Congress saying, essentially everyone in Gaza is Hamas, then what is he proposing? Rivka, I mean, what do you make of this? Rashida Tlaib censured for saying something incredibly reasonable, the only Palestinian American in Congress. And what you are allowed to say in Congress is that basically every Gazan is a legitimate target.
It's interesting, actually, because I think, what we're seeing with the contrast you've just presented there between Brian Mast and what he was permitted to say and Rashida Tlaib and what she was censured for saying mirrors the kind of military double standards that we apply to Israel, or that the US is applying, and certainly the UK is following suit to Israel. Israel has free reign. Israel has a blank check. Brian Mast can say whatever he wants. And Palestinians are forced to live in an open air prison. Rashida Tlaib is being confined, continually constrained in what she can and can't say. It's the most shameful period of America's history, that at a moment when her own grandparents, her own grandmother, in that video, she holds up a framed photograph of her grandma who lives in the West Bank, while her own family are there suffering at the hands of this Israeli onslaught. She isn't allowed to speak about it. It parallels it almost, it takes me back to the words of Israel's former Prime Minister Golda Meir, when she said that there were no such thing as Palestinians when Israel was established. It's as if America doesn't even want to recognize the existence in its midst of a Palestinian woman. And I think, actually, if we think about it, something very eerily similar is happening in UK politics, except it's even more invisible. Rashida Tlaib, even though she's facing this censure, her being censured is front page news, and that's because she's an enormously well-loved and well-known politician. I think, the last general election that she faced, she won by a huge majority, something like 84%. Whereas in the UK, the kind of equivalent politicians, people like Layla Moran and the Lib Dems, the Scottish First Minister, Humza Yousaf, whose parents are in Gaza as we speak. Why is this not front page news every single day? Why is Humza Yousaf not being given a platform to speak out about what his own parents are being subjected to in Gaza every day? It's because to do so would be to enormously disrupt the manufactured consensus within Britain's political establishment, which contains within it people who are directly implicated in the ongoing struggle. And so not only do we have people like Rashida Tlaib being silenced in the UK, we don't even hear from these people. I think I saw one interview with Layla Moran from a few weeks ago, and maybe Hamza Youssef did a press conference or something, but they've not even been given an ounce of the airtime that Rashida Tlaib has. But it's obvious the reason why commentators in the US and now Tlaib's colleagues in the House of Representatives are fixating so much on this phrase "from the river to the sea." It's an interesting phrase, by the way, and I actually did an explainer on it on our Instagram recently. People should go and watch it. What people don't know is that it's mentioned, not only, it's often talked about as being cited in the Hamas constitution of 2017, which I believe says something like, Hamas rejects any alternative to the full and complete liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. But it's also used in the Likud constitution, the constitution of the political party that Netanyahu leads. So the first clause of that charter says, between the sea and the Jordan, there will be only Israeli sovereignty. And I think it's really interesting if we compare these two things. One is demanding Palestinian liberation, Palestine will be free, and the other is demanding Israeli sovereignty, which is something completely different and suggests total Israeli and Jewish control over Judea and Samaria, which is what it's referred to as in the Likud charter. So, the idea that from the river to the sea is a uniquely Palestinian phrase is completely false. It's cited right up there in the Likud charter in a way more eliminationist way than we hear in the Hamas charter. But then when we hear it on the streets, it's even further removed. It's literally just a call for Palestinian freedom from apartheid, from blockade, and from occupation between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. And I think the idea, it's so telling to me that the idea that this contested phrase has been interpreted in a singular way as genocidal towards Jewish people tells us a huge amount about whose forms of knowledge are valid and whose are not, whose existences matter and whose don't. If we have a fundamental disagreement about the meaning of a phrase, I say it means this and you say it means that, the idea that we should unilaterally be able to say, no, actually, it's this, suggests whose perspectives and whose epistemologies we care about. And in this case, it's Zionist and right-wing Jewish epistemologies which are being privileged. It's so fundamentally clear to me that this is not a call for Jewish genocide. That's not how I hear it. I'm a Jewish person. That's just simply not what I hear. But what is really clear is that Israel is using explicitly genocidal language about Palestinians, referring to them as human animals. Even earlier, we were talking about how Labour refers to Palestine supporters as fleas. Zoological terminology is a telltale sign of genocidal intent. And we know that Israel not only has that intent and has that rhetoric, but has that military capability. And the shifting of the discourse from kind of actual military violence to rhetorical violence is a straight up kind of distraction tactic. And it's been remarkably effective.
I think that sort of point of who gets to say, I'm offended, so you can't say that, is really telling. I mean, how does it feel for a Palestinian to have 10,000 people, people of your country being killed, most of them civilians, a shed load of them children, and then you just hear politicians repeat, Israel has a right to defend itself. What does Israel have a right to defend itself mean in that context? Can you imagine if you went on the television after Hamas did the October the 7th attacks and said, well, Palestine has a right to defend itself, right? Why is this so different? Yet one of those is sayable and the other isn't, right? It's very, very odd. Well, it's not odd because it's very obvious what's going on. It seems to me to be clearly sort of tied up with racism, who is allowed to say things, whose offense matters. If a Palestinian is offended by people talking about them as human shields or saying that Israel has a right to defend itself and therefore bombing hospitals is okay, if they're offended by that, well, who cares? They're Palestinian, doesn't matter, right? If you have people who are pro-Israel especially from the Jewish community, but other Zionists in general, who think it's very, very upsetting to hear someone say, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Suddenly that has to get taken very, very seriously. It's talked about by politicians, talked about endlessly on Twitter, sort of this policing of who can say what. Why does one group of people's offence matter and another group of people's offence doesn't? Right? And I think, to be honest, it's the Labour frontbench who are most guilty of this, of sort of policing what people who are sort of talking in favour of Palestine are allowed to say, and not policing in any way whatsoever what they themselves say when it comes to the mass death of Palestinian people, the mass killing of Palestinian people. And I want to go back to the sort of topic that we started this section with, which was US support for Israel and how unquestioning and unconditional it has been. And because I want to show you a clip of an Israeli who is much more critical, who's asking for something else from the Americans. So Maoz Inon is a Israeli man whose elderly father and mother were killed in the October 7th attacks. He had this message for those world leaders who are currently supporting the government of Benjamin Netanyahu.
Again, to ask Netanyahu to go? Or do you have to wait for the end of the war? Or
Because because of your question,
yes,
and your leaders and world leaders that are waiting for the war to stop before they will stop supporting Israeli government, the war would never end. The war would never end as long as Netanyahu is in his office. So I'm crying to the world, don't support Netanyahu. Don't send us weapons. Don't send us ships of war. Send us peace. Send us love. Send us reconciliation.
Remember, that's a man whose two parents were killed on October the 7th, and he speaks with such moral clarity, with such dignity, saying, this person who's in charge of Israel, right, he does not want peace. He is the person who's backing all the settlers in the West Bank. He's the person who, in his party's constitution, as you say, Rivka, wants all of the space between the river and the sea to be Israel. He doesn't think there are any Palestinians. And whatever support you give to Benjamin Netanyahu, he is going to use that support to that end. You really think that when the Americans send weapons to Benjamin Netanyahu and shed loads of money to Benjamin Netanyahu, he thinks, "Oh, I'm only going to use these weapons to fight terrorism. Right? I'm only going to use this financial support to make sure that Israel is strong within its 1967 borders." No, if you're supporting Benjamin Netanyahu, you are supporting Benjamin Netanyahu to do whatever he wants to do, and he's been able to do whatever he wants to do for the past decade or so. I mean, he's been in power for a very long time, hasn't he? Rivka, very impressive, that man's words. I assume, though, it's very much a minority position in Israel. I mean, do you have any insight on that?
I mean, I've both personal and I suppose more statistical. We have some polling from Israel which suggests that there are mixed feelings about, the war. There's certainly not mixed feelings about Netanyahu, though. There was a poll by Israel's Channel 12 recently, which suggested that 76% of Israelis think that Netanyahu should resign. But another poll published by the Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv, which suggested that 65% of Israelis do want a ground invasion, even though about half of the country also wants that to not happen immediately. So there is definitely a sort of fog of war that has whipped up a huge number of Israelis into a frenzy, as well it might. I mean, how would you or I respond if our country was under attack? And also, how would you or I respond if we were living in a country with a closed media environment? It's really important to stress that. You know, in October, we saw the Israeli government pass emergency legislation which criminalized individuals, civilians and journalists who damage national morale. We've also seen it introduce legislation which will allow it to shutter news sites and media platforms that do the same, that are undermining national security. So Israel's written itself a blank check to effectively censor its own media environment, which it's done incredibly successfully, such that we don't hear voices like Maoz, who you've just quoted there. And usually people like him, and I also saw a similar video of a 19-year-old who was involved in the massacre at a Be'eri kibbutz in Israel, who was saying something similar. And she was speaking on her own platform. Maoz, I mean, I don't think that's an Israeli platform that he's speaking on there. These people people are often having to circumvent the very closed Israeli media environment to have a hearing. But it is probably true to say that that the idea of a ceasefire is a hugely unpopular one in Israel, even if people do place the blame as much with Netanyahu as they do Hamas. But yeah, it's really worrying. I've been talking to people that I know in Israel, including members of my own family, who are saying really worrying things. I used to, support a two-state solution. I used to be on the left, but now how can you defend what's going on? I do think that this war and the presentation of it in a very propagandized kind of Israeli media environment is radicalizing a huge number of Israelis, not least because, as we know, Israel has a mandatory adult conscription, meaning that pretty much everyone knows a reservist, has family and friends that are reservists and are fighting this war actively. So, the conscription, ideologically as much as militarily, of Israeli civilians into this war has been incredibly effective.